This session looks at enums. Enums are useful where we have a category that we might want to assign to an object, for example. So I've got an example project here, and I'm going to talk through the project, and we'll take it from a sort of problem-based approach where we look at the problem and then we'll look at how enums can help solve the particular problem. So first thing I want to show you is I have a class called clothing items. So the idea is we're going to imagine we're building a system to use in let's say a clothes shop. And it's kind of trivialized because there would obviously be a lot more to any given item of clothing than we've got here, but our clothing item has a name, a category, and a price. When we create a clothing item, we have to supply the name, the category, and the price. We've got methods to get the name and the category. We can't change the name and the category once we've created the item. And we've got an option to get and set the price, because prices typically do change. I guess the other thing to add to that is that we're imagining in our fictional clothing store that we have sections for men, women, kids, and accessories. So they're the kind of types of clothing that we are gonna store. Okay, so that's all that class is. Okay, so it's just a clothing item with a name, a category, and a price, of which only we can change the price. And then we've got our main. Now our main class has a list of all the clothes, and when we run our main method, we create, just for example purposes, 3 different items of clothing. T-shirt, which goes into the men category, its skirt and tights that go into the women category. We add them all to the all clothes list, and we also have a method here that gets the women's clothes. Okay, and what that does is it creates a new array list. It goes through all of the existing clothing items, and if the category is the women category, then it will add that women's clothing to that list. Okay, so we could test this. We could write a loop here. We could say array list of clothing item women's clothes, and we could say that is going to be the result of calling the women's clothes method. So that would get us the array list, and we could say for item in, or we've got to give it a type, and it's a clothing item in clothing item in women's clothes. Then we'll print out the item dot name, and then we'll append that with a colon and append that with the price. Now I put the price in as an integer because working with pence is much safer. You know, if we use, for example, a decimal and we do some kind of 50% off or 25% off, we could end up with something that isn't a whole number of pennies, and obviously we can't split pennies in real life. So for now I'm just going to show the price as in pence. You know, in reality we'd probably do some formatting. We'd work out what the pound component is, the pence component, and format it all nicely like that, but we shan't worry about that for now. So let's just check this works, and then we'll look at some other potential problems. Okay, so we've got the 2 items, women clothes. We're not including the t-shirt, which is in the men category. Okay, so it should be reasonably straightforward to add a new clothing item. So let's add I don't know, a dress, new clothing item, I don't know, red dress, category women, price, I don't know, $34.99. Okay, so if we run that, we should see that in the list we get our dress printed out. Okay, but you can see I've run it and it isn't printed out. And those who've been paying attention will probably have noticed that I did not capitalize the W on women. Okay, so it hasn't been included in the list. Okay, because our filter here just looks to see if the category is women. So this is a potential problem, an error that could sneak in. We really want a better way of ensuring that clothes only go into one of the 4 predefined categories. Okay, so one approach is to say, well, okay, let's define in our clothing item, we could say final static. Typically, the way of doing things is to use an integer, but you don't have to, okay? And then we'd say, and the naming convention for a final static variable, which is essentially a constant, because we can't change it, it doesn't change, we could say, is to use capitals, so we could say women's. If we had more than one word, you'd separate it with an underscore, so women's clothe item? I don't know, women's clothing item. Okay, that's a bit long, so we'll just stick with women's. And then we typically give that a value, so we might say that's equal to 0, and then we might declare another one, static in men's equals 1, final static in children's equals 2, final static int accessories equals 3. Okay, and then what we would do is we would go away and change the structure of our thing. So we'd say, instead of using the string for the category, we'd say, well, okay, the category is going to be an integer. Okay, so we'd obviously have to change this here. Okay, and then again, our get category is going to return an int. We've got a couple of other problems that relate to our main class, in that here we're setting the category. Now, how does this help us avoid it? Well, we made our these items final and static. What we didn't do is make them public, so we need to make them public as well, so we can access them outside the class. Okay, and what we could do is we could say, well, okay, instead of using the string, we've now got to make it an integer, okay? And instead of just typing a 0 or a 1, which we can do, instead we can say, well, actually, we can go to our clothing item, and we can do clothing item dot, okay, and then pick the various values. So that makes a little bit more sense. You can see quite clearly clothing item dot, and that was women's, and then we can add that one, clothing item dot women's, and here clothing item. Okay, and then we just one related fix here where we're checking the category. It's now an integer, so we would then check the category is equal to clothing item dot women's. And that's all well and good. We can run it. We should now see that all our values are printed out. They're not. What have I done wrong here? Women's. I think I have to get category. Oh, we didn't add the dress. So there was another error, which would have meant we wouldn't have seen the dress anyway, even if it was a string, which is slightly unfortunate, but you can take my word for it. The fact that it was a lowercase w would have meant that it wouldn't appear. Now that we've added it, though, and that we've made sure we're using this this final static integer variable, you can see that it now works. It doesn't solve the problem entirely, however, because it's perfectly possible for me to just type in any old integer value there. Okay, so I can run that. The code won't crash, but now we're going to lose grey types from our list. So really, we want to get into a position where it's not possible to create a clothing item without supplying the right value. The other thing is, when we come to write our, let's say we want to create another clothing item, jeans, let's get some children's jeans, new clothing item, kids jeans. All that I know here is that it's an integer for category. It doesn't tell me, without going and looking in the clothing item class, how do I know which category is which? Okay, I kind of then got to go, okay, well, what value did I give it? Go to my clothing item class, children's 2, okay, go back, put a 2 in there, or realised by looking at clothing item that, okay, by looking here we find it, but we don't know that. It doesn't tell us anything here unless we add a comment. So it's not perfect, but we can still do that, obviously. Okay, so the solution to the problem is to use something called an enum, an enumerated type. So essentially we can say, and we can put this, enums can exist either as a class of their own, and enum technically under the hood are a class, or we can have them as a member of something else. So in this case it makes sense, I guess, because it's a very small limited system, that the clothing item can have the categories that belong to it, like we've done here. Okay, so we can say something like enum category, okay, and all we need to do is specify the values and separate them by a comma. So I'm going to say women's, comma, men's, comma, children's, comma, accessories. Okay, and that is all you need to do. Now this now exists as a type, okay, and we can use that instead. So I'm going to get rid of these for now, okay, and I'm going to say, instead of being an integer, I want this to be a category. Okay, now we've now got underlying problems because we're saying this dot category is a category, so I need to change this to be a category. This is going to return a category, and there we go. But we've got problems in our main as well. Okay, so now we try to use clothing item dot men's. Okay, but if we look at the constructor, what's the constructor going to tell us it wants? It wants a category. So we could say something like category belongs to clothing item, so we can say category dot and then pass in, so this was a men's one, and you'll see that it's actually clothing item because it belongs to the clothing item class dot category dot men's. So what I can do here is say clothing item dot category dot women's here, and that was women's as well. This was women's, this was children's. And when we create the constructor, when we create a new class using the constructor, so we can say clothing item, I don't know what the accessories, earrings. We could say new clothing item, I don't know, gold earrings. And it will tell us it needs, which should do eventually, let's just try, it needs a category. Okay, so we can say category, we start typing category, it will suggest, so we can say category dot accessories, and then we can give it a price. Okay, the one final thing we need to do here is to check the category against the category enum type. So now it's not possible, if I try and create this and I provide a value of like a 7 instead, it's going to complain. It's going to say no, you can't do that. It's not allowed. So it basically forces us, it ensures that we can't use anything other than one of the values in this particular category. The other thing I did say is, now it might be that we have other things we sell in our shop that don't count as clothing, but maybe come under those categories. Okay, so what we could do is we could say, well, actually in the system, that category makes sense for more than just a clothing item. If we want that to be the case, we could just say new Java class. If we use enum, it will just put enum in for us. So we could say enum, we could say category, hit enter. And instead of having it here, we could just cut that, go here, put those in there. Now, the only thing that is now an issue is that we were trying to use our category in the context of a clothing item. Okay, so category is still fine because category exists in the same package. Okay, so those related problems are in our main class where we're trying to use clothing item dot category. Category now exists as its own type, so we can just use category dot. Okay. The question as to whether to make something. So if we go back to what we had before, we had an inner. We've got to fix it here as well. The enum was essentially an inner class. It was inside the clothing item, and the decision to where to locate it is based on the usage. If that category is only relevant to the class type that you're in, so if categories only ever existed for clothing item, it would make sense for clothing item to own or to have inside it the category enum type. But if category existed for other types of things, that same set of categories, so in this case, it's a shop area, really. Maybe we could call it shop area rather than category. If there were other products that weren't clothing that would be put in one of those four categories, or for example, we had staff that were trained for a particular category, and we had the system, as well as incorporating, the sales, also incorporated the staff. You might then say, well, okay, category exists outside of the that area. You can still group related things in packages if you have a very large project. So you might have a package shop and then another package employee or what have you. So there's different ways of splitting things up. But yeah, so if you have the enum in its own file, the name of the enum must match the name of the file. Okay. If it goes inside something else, obviously not a problem, because obviously the public class matches the name of the file and it's internal to that. Okay, so if you get to a point where you think, well, actually there are only certain types of things this could be, and these are in general not going to change, okay, you've got to bear in mind the fact that if you build a part of a larger system, if a new category is likely to be invented, you wouldn't necessarily use this approach, okay? You might, chances are you'd have a database in the back end or what have you, and you might allow new categories to be added. But if you know that categories are going to be fixed, okay, let's take the idea we're building, say, a system to represent the type of fuel used for an oven that you might put in your house, okay? In reality, you're probably only going to use electric, gas, or gas that comes in bottles, okay? It is highly unlikely, and if it did happen, it would be a very rare thing that would happen, that the fuel type would be, a new fuel type would come along. So it would be safe to build into the system, because only once in 50 years does this new fuel type come along, and sure, it's okay to get a developer in to modify the system. If you are building something that changes more rapidly, let's say you're a expanding retailer, you sell different types of products, but you expand your product line, you don't want categories for those products to be hard coded into the system, because then you need to get a software developer in every time you want to add a new sort of type of thing that you're going to sell. Okay, so it does take some thought as to whether an enum is the appropriate approach to the problem.